Okay, we started talking about behavioral finance last time, and we'll continue with that discussion today. This field of behavioral finance, as the name suggests, this is about behavior, and that behavior, generally speaking, can be investor behavior, or it could also be behavior of companies, executives, corporate insiders, CEOs, and all, right? So since we are focused on investments, we are going to focus on investor behavior, right? We see applications of behavioral finance quite often. I mean, if you think about dot-com bubble, there is this talk about investor euphoria. There over optimism bidding up the prices of securities too much. But on the other hand, we also have uh, the crisis type of situations, kind of like what we are going through right now, when investors are showing extreme fear, they are panicking. And in those type of situations also, sometimes this behavioral biases could lead to overreaction in their in and leading to mispricing of securities, right? Last time we looked at some anecdotal evidence of behavioral biases, irrational behavior of investors, and we also started looking at how some of these biases can lead to errors in information processing, thereby resulting in mispricing, right? So we talked about forecasting errors like recency bias. We talked about this very pervasive bias, very widely observed overconfidence. We also talked about conservatism bias, that is the idea that uh, investors are reluctant to give up their preconceived notions. They are too tied to those beliefs, and even if there is new information that contradicts those ideas, they are unable to update their beliefs in light of this new information. Okay, so few other biases that we are going to talk about today. One is representativeness bias. So many of these biases are actually based on the work by Kahneman and Tversky. Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel laureate, and Amos Tversky. So they did a number of experiments to sort of see how people or subjects in that those experiments respond uh, to various situations, and then they came up with these various behavioral biases that people tend to exhibit or they are prone to. And then the field of behavioral finance and economics was about applying these behavioral biases to understanding the source of mispricing, right? So here is one other bias. This one is known as representativeness bias. You can see the example here. This is again from Kahneman and Tversky's experimentation. Uh, they are psychologists, they are not economists. So many of these examples do not directly appear to be relevant to finance, but they have found applications eventually in the field of finance. So representativeness bias, basically it means that what you observe in a relatively small sample, you tend to draw generalizations from that and believe that that small sample is representative of a bigger population, and what is observed in a smaller sample would actually be seen in a bigger population as well, right? So this is like I've said here, extrapolation of trends from a smaller sample to a bigger population, believing that that trend is actually a general trend, which may not be true, right? So if you look at this example here, I mean, if you read through this, Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright, majored in philosophy. She was concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations, right? So that is the information that is provided to subjects in an experiment, and then they are asked which one of the following is more likely, right? Linda is a bank teller, which is statement A. As you can see, this is completely unrelated to the information that is provided. The second one is Linda is a bank teller and active in feminist movement, right? So if you carefully read through this statement B in particular, right, uh, even this statement is completely unrelated to the information that is provided, right? Is active in feminist movement. Now, there is nowhere in this information that suggests that Linda is active in feminist movement, but she seems to be representative of someone who might be involved in feminist movement, right? Because she's involved in issues of discrimination and social justice and so on. So it seems like she is representative of someone who might be involved in feminist movement. So even though both of these statements are not related to the information provided, when subjects are asked which one is more likely, a majority of subjects choose statement B simply because of the fact that feminist movement is mentioned here. So based on this information that is provided here, they are extrapolating, right? They are basically drawing this conclusion that Linda is involved in feminist movement. So that is representativeness bias, extrapolating trends from a smaller sample and believing that those trends would be observed in a bigger population at large. Okay. All right, and the last one that I want to talk about in this information processing error category is the anchoring bias. It's more, I mean, to be more accurate, it should be referred to as anchoring and adjustment bias. Okay, let me directly go to the examples here and show you what the experiment showed, which led to this particular bias here. Okay, let's look at the example. So let's first look at this example at the bottom. Here in the experiment again by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, uh, subjects were asked to estimate the product of numbers from 1 through 8. In the first group of subjects, the numbers were listed from 8 to 1, as you can see here, and in the other group, the numbers were listed from 1 through 8, right? So the order was different, and they were asked to provide a quick estimate, meaning that the correct answer was not expected, just the estimate. The first group came up with an estimate of 20 to 50. The second group came up with an estimate of 512. Both of those were way below the correct answer, but again, the correct answer wasn't expected since this was supposed to be a quick estimate. What is important here to note is that the estimate was much higher in the first case versus the second one, right? And why is that the case? Well, the explanation is that when subjects in the experiment saw bigger numbers early on in the sequence, they thought that the product would be higher. When they saw smaller numbers early on in this sequence, they thought that the product would be lower, right? So these early numbers in the sequence sort of became an anchor in investors' mind and influenced their decision regarding the estimate, right? So this is an example of anchoring bias. This is another famous experiment. In this experiment, subjects were asked to estimate what fraction of countries that belong to United Nations are from Africa, right? Again, these are carefully controlled experiments, so there is no reason to believe that the two groups that are involved in experiments are any different in terms of their knowledge of these things, right? So two groups again, they were provided a random number between 1 to 100 as an initial guess. This was an arbitrary random number and the groups were aware of that. One group was provided a random estimate of 10, so basically 10% of the countries are from Africa, and the other group was provided with an initial estimate of 60%, right? Again, these were completely arbitrary numbers, and they were asked to basically come up with a final estimate of what they think is the fraction of countries from Africa. The first group that was provided with an initial estimate of 10% came up with the final average response of 25%. The second group that was provided an initial estimate of 60% came up with a final response of 45% on average, right? So you can see the response, the average estimate was much higher when the initial estimate was 60%. It was lower when the initial estimate was 10%, right? So what's going on here? In this case, what is happening is that again, subjects are trying to adjust that initial estimate, right? So 10% seemed too low, so the adjustment was upwards. They tried to adjust it higher, and they arrived at a final response of 25%. In the second group, the initial estimate was 60%, and that seemed too high, right? So they adjusted it downwards, and in this case, they came up with a final response of 45%. Now, the thing to note here is that the two final estimates are still very, very different, right? I mean, one is 25%, one is 45%. So what that is telling us is that even though invest or subjects tried to sort of adjust those initial estimates, that adjustment was insufficient, right? It was incomplete. They were still too anchored or too tied to the initial estimate. The group that started with 10%, it tried to get away from that 10% but could not get away sufficiently. The group that started with 60% also tried to get away from this 60% estimate in the downward direction and coming up with a lower estimate, but that adjustment was insufficient. They were too anchored to this arbitrary initial estimate, and even though there was an adjustment, that adjustment was insufficient, right? So that's why this is referred to as anchoring and adjustment bias. So what this tells us this that even if the initial estimate is random or arbitrary, it still influences decision making, right? Investors still, or subjects in this experiments still showed anchoring to those initial estimates, right? So this is the anchoring bias. So that initial anchor might be arbitrary, it might be something that is relevant to that situation, but also be completely random. People try to use what we refer to as heuristic reasoning. uh, Heuristics, they try to adjust the estimates, but the adjustment is insufficient, and therefore the final results are biased, right? This is the anchoring and adjustment bias. In our finance context, if you recall the 52-week high momentum strategy, this is the strategy where stocks trading close to 52-week high, they tend to perform better. Stocks trading close to or far below the 52-week high, they tend to have inferior performance, right? And why this strategy works, one of the popular explanations is rooted in anchoring and adjustment bias. So the idea is that this 52-week high price of any stock, that's a very readily available, highly salient piece of information, right? It's very widely reported, and that forms an anchor in investors' mind, this 52-week high price. And when they see a stock trading close to 52-week high, the belief is that that stock is trading at a very high price and it should go down, right? So investors, even if there is like a positive news for a stock trading close to 52-week high, investors are reluctant to bid up the price of that stock too much, right? A stock is trading close to 52-week high, the view is that this stock is already trading too high. Even if there is good news, people are reluctant to buy the stock with that belief that it is already elevated, right? So that good news is not fully reflected in the prices right away. Gradually, people realize their mistake and that information is reflected in the prices, but with a lag, not right away. So we see this good performance sort of show up subsequently, but not immediately. Similarly, if you have a stock that is trading way below the 52-week high price, and let's say there is some negative information, some bad news about that particular stock, the investors are reluctant to bid down the price of that stock too much, because the belief is that relative to the 52-week high, it is already trading at such a low price, and you don't want the stock uh, or you don't believe that the stock should go down even further, even if there is bad news that warrants that the price should go down. So there is underreaction to bad news in this case. Eventually the news prevails, the information prevails, it is reflected in the prices, but over time, not right away. So this is an underreaction story. In this case, investors are underreacting to information because of anchoring and adjustment bias, and that underreaction explains the superior performance of stocks trading close to 52-week high over stocks that are far below their 52-week high price. Okay, so this is an example of anchoring and adjustment. Then the other set of biases that I want to discuss are what are referred to as framing effects. Framing is basically this idea that if you have same information that is presented in different ways, that might actually elicit a very different response or decision, right? So just to give you a popular example of this framing effect, here in this example you have some uh, cancer patients and their doctors as subjects, and they are provided some information regarding the effectiveness of surgery and radiation treatments, right? So this first way to portray this information or convey this information is what is referred to as the survival frame, right? So survival frame is basically that the effectiveness is presented in terms of how many people survive through this treatment procedures. Like, so if you look at the statement here, for surgery, of 100 people having surgery, 90 live through the procedure, 68 are alive at the end of first year, and 34 are alive at the end of 5 years, right? So this is what we refer to as survival frame. The same information can also be presented in terms of what we call as the mortality frame. Like, so here, instead of saying of 100 people having surgery, 90 live through the procedure, it could also be stated as of 100 people having surgery, 10 die during the surgery, right? So instead of saying 90 live through the procedure, we can say 10 die. Like 68 are alive at the end of first year, 32 die by the end of first year, right? 34 are alive at the end of 5 years, so 66 die by the end of 5 years, right? So you can present the information in the survival frame, making or conveying how many people are living through the procedure at various points in time, or you can present that same information in mortality frame. Same thing with the radiation therapy, right? So of 100 people having radiation, all live through the treatment. So of 100 people having radiation, none die during treatment. 77 are alive at the end of 1 year. So 23 die by the end of 1 year, and so on, right? So uh, what was found in this experimentation was that when information is presented in survival frame and when it is presented in mortality frame, the choice regarding which procedure to go with is very different. In one case, only 18% of the uh, patients prefer radiation therapy, but in the other case, 44% of the patients actually prefer radiation therapy, right? So it's the exact same information presented differently, and the choice of the treatment procedure is very different across the two groups. And this groups of individuals included patients or their doctors, so similar outcome was observed in both those categories, right? So that is what is referred to as framing, that same information presented in different uh, ways, how choices are framed can influence what decision is made based on that information. Okay, so this obviously has important implications, right? I mean, this particular example is very popular because after this type of experiment, it was realized that it is very important to make sure that people are making the right decision, uh, and the information needs to be conveyed accordingly. In a case of finance and economics, the type of framing that has found a lot of applications is mental accounting. So mental accounting, I mean, again, I can give you a couple of examples here. For example, when people are sort of saving money for variety of purposes, they make this different sort of categories in their minds as to what those savings are for, and then they have this different treatment for those different parts of their portfolio, right? So let's say an investor has like $100,000 portfolio. It's a one single portfolio, but in investor's mind, uh, the investor has decided that okay, 50,000 out of this 100,000 is for retirement, 30,000 is for kids college education, 20,000 is for vacation and other expenses and so on, right? So there are all these different mental accounts in the mind of the investor, even though it's like the one single portfolio, right? Now the problem there is that with this mental accounts that the investor has, the investor actually and would end up making suboptimal choices regarding how investment is made for this 100,000. It was found in experiments that, for example, people are more conservative when they think that the money is for kids' college education, but they are willing to take more risk for money that they think is saved for vacation or other such discretionary purposes, right? So there are different mental accounts regarding this different goals for saving, and the portfolio decisions are made accordingly. Okay. House money effect, that is another very common example of mental accounting, and you might have actually experienced this if you have been to, say, a casino in Vegas, right? So let's say you go to the casino and you are uh, uh, gambling. I mean, whatever is your preferred uh, choice of losing money, I guess, playing slots or blackjack or whatnot. So, anyways, you say uh, take $100 and say put that in slot machines, and let's say you actually end up winning. You end up winning $50. So now you have 150. At that point, you can take that $150 and leave the casino, go home, right? However, people do not behave that way generally speaking. So they separate the $100 which they brought from home from the $50 that is newly earned. So they have now two different mental accounts. One is for $100. They continue to think of this $100 as their own money, right? Because that is what they brought from home. And $50 that is newly earned, even though that is also their money now, they continue to think of this as the house money, and they are willing to continue gambling, and if they end up losing $50, they don't feel as bad, because the belief is that that was house money, and it's not your money that was lost, even though you had won that money, and after winning that money it was actually your money. So the $100 that was brought from home initially is treated differently from the $50 that is newly earned, even though after winning that $50 it's basically the same money, it belongs to you. So this is the house money effect, that you end up creating two separate accounts in your minds, and you treat those uh, the money that you have sort of put in those different mental accounts differently, right? So that is the house money effect. So one very a common use of mental accounting is in what is known as disposition effect. But in order to talk about disposition effect, we first need to discuss this prospect theory, right? So we'll talk about prospect theory next. So we have talked about various behavioral biases: forecasting errors, overconfidence, conservatism bias, anchoring and adjustment, representativeness, and then these framing effects and mental accounting, right? Uh, so we'll talk about prospect theory next.